The man who walked into the police station that morning didn't look like a killer. He looked like a father, a husband, a man who paid his taxes, mowed his lawn, and brought his son to football games on weekends. He wore a dark coat zipped to the top, hands shaking slightly as he handed a folded piece of paper to the officer at the front desk. "My name's Martin Rourke," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I killed someone 28 years ago. I want to tell you everything." It was January in Lincoln, Nebraska, just another slow day at the precinct until that moment. For nearly 3 decades, the murder of 17-year-old Casey Bell had haunted the quiet town of Fairvale, 30 miles south. It was a case everyone knew, but no one talked about anymore. Casey's body had never been found. Rumors swirled for years. He'd run away, gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd, maybe even left on purpose. His mother never believed it. Neither did his sister. Martin Rourke's confession reopened a wound that had never really closed. But what shocked everyone wasn't just that he did it. It was why he did it, and how long he had lived with the truth. This is the story of a man who buried a body, a secret, and a part of himself, and how guilt eventually brought it all to the surface. Every crime tells a story. But the truth, the real truth, always hides deeper. Beneath the confessions, beneath the headlines, beneath the surface. This is where we go when the facts aren't enough, where we ask the questions no one dares to. Why do people snap? What haunts a killer long after the blood has dried? And can guilt be more powerful than justice? If you're drawn to the shadows where secrets live, you're in the right place. Subscribe to uncover the darkest corners of the human mind. Comment your thoughts. Do you believe redemption is ever truly possible? Turn on notifications so you never miss a twist in our next story. Welcome to Beneath the Surface, the dark side of crime. Real stories, raw emotion, and the haunting truths buried deep within us all. Back then, in the summer of 1996, Martin Rourke was just 19, skinny, soft-spoken, always looking down when he walked. He worked nights at Mullen's Auto Shop, just off the main road in Fairvale. His mom was usually passed out by 6 p.m., and his dad, when he wasn't locked up, was someone Martin avoided mentioning altogether. He saved every dollar he could, dreaming of moving to Denver and leaving it all behind. Fairvale was the kind of town you either stayed in forever or escaped from before it swallowed you whole. For Martin, escape felt like salvation. But then came Casey Bell. Casey was everything Martin wasn't. Loud, charismatic, athletic, a bit of a punk if you asked some folks. But he had a way of making people laugh, even while pushing their buttons, especially Martin's. It started small. Casey would cut through the back of the shop on his skateboard, sometimes banging on the window just to startle Martin while he was under a car. He'd make jokes in front of girls, call him Grease Monkey or Ghost Boy. Sometimes Martin laughed it off. Sometimes he didn't. But one Friday night, everything went wrong. It was July 5th. The air still smelled like fireworks and gasoline. Martin had just finished a double shift and was locking up when he saw Casey behind the diner next door, lighting a cigarette and laughing with 2 of his friends. Martin tried to walk past, head down, when Casey called out to him, "Hey, Rourke, you finally get that oil out of your brain?" The guys laughed. Martin didn't answer. He kept walking. Then Casey said something that stopped him cold. Something about Martin's mom, her being the town drunk, how she'd once begged a store clerk for a bottle of vodka in her pajamas. Something nobody should have known, especially not Casey. Martin turned. He saw the smirk on Casey's face, the way his friends tried to hold in their laughter. And something inside Martin snapped. He didn't remember walking up. He didn't remember grabbing the tire iron from the back of his truck. He only remembered the sound, that terrible, hollow crack, as Casey's skull met steel. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. His friends had run. Casey didn't move. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and slow, soaking into the gravel. Martin stood there, frozen. He dropped the tire iron, his breathing sharp and uneven. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. Then instinct kicked in. He dragged the body behind the shop, into the woods that backed up to the junkyard. It was dense, quiet, forgotten. He buried Casey beneath a pile of scrap metal and torn-up tires, covering him with dirt, rust, and fear. No one saw him. No one came looking that night, and Martin never spoke of it again. Martin Rourke didn't sleep the night after he killed Casey Bell, or the night after that, or the week after that. But eventually, something strange happened. Time didn't stop. The sun kept rising. The world didn't know. And because of that, he learned how to pretend. At first, Martin thought he'd get caught. Every siren made his chest tighten. Every knock at the door made him sweat. But days turned to weeks, and no police ever came. The Bell family put up flyers. Friends of Casey passed them around school. One rumor said he'd run away to Arizona. Another said he'd overdosed, and someone had hidden the body out of shame. But no one looked too hard. Not in a town like Fairvale. Martin used that to his advantage. He packed up everything he owned, a few clothes, a duffel bag of tools, and $900 in cash, and drove west in his beat-up Chevy. He changed the license plate in a motel parking lot outside of Grand Island and never used his real name again. By the time he reached Colorado, he had a new one, Daniel Reed. He settled in Greeley, a working-class town with oil rigs in the distance and a Walmart on every corner. It was unremarkable, which made it perfect. Martin, now Daniel, found work at a repair shop, just like before. He kept his head down, showed up early, never caused trouble. He became the guy everyone liked but no one really knew. The man who remembered birthdays but never talked about his own. And when people asked about his past, he told them his parents were dead and that he'd moved around a lot. Over the next 10 years, he built a life from scratch. He met Rachel, a second-grade teacher, after fixing her car one snowy morning. She said he had kind eyes and a quiet charm. He said almost nothing, but something about her warmth melted the cold inside him. They got married a year later, bought a small house with a fenced yard, and had a son, Eli. For a while, Martin believed he had escaped it, that the version of himself who lived in Fairvale had been buried along with Casey. But guilt has a long memory, and it doesn't care about your new name. The first nightmare came on Eli's 5th birthday. Martin had been working late the night before, making a toy chest for his son by hand. Something simple, painted blue. But when he finally fell asleep, the dream came. Casey was standing in the woods again, blood matting his hair, staring at Martin with wide, empty eyes. "You forgot about me," Casey whispered. Martin woke up screaming. From that night on, the dreams came regularly. Sometimes Casey was silent. Other times, he begged to be found. Once, Martin dreamed that his own son was digging in the junkyard, calling out, "Dad? There's someone here." He couldn't explain it to Rachel. She thought he had PTSD from something in his childhood. "You don't have to talk about it," she said gently, "but maybe you should talk to someone." He nodded, and then did nothing. Instead, he began writing. In a locked notebook, stashed inside an old box beneath the floorboards of the garage, he began to journal everything. Not just what happened that night, but everything he felt about it. It should have been me. I wanted to hit him, but I didn't want him to die. Not really. I just wanted it all to stop. I see his face everywhere now, even in Eli's. That smile, it's the same. God help me. I can't even look at myself in mirrors anymore. What if he's behind me? The entries weren't just therapy. They were confession. The only one he could give. Martin tried to make peace in small ways. He began donating anonymously every Christmas to the Bell Family Memorial Fund. $500 a year, slipped in a plain envelope with no return address. He followed the Facebook page run by Casey's sister Monica under a fake profile. Sometimes he left messages of support as Chris R., just short prayers or hearts. She never knew. Once, during Eli's ninth-grade field trip, they passed through Nebraska. Martin detoured the bus route he was chaperoning and drove past Fairvale in the dead of night. He parked outside the auto shop, now boarded up, and stared at it until his hands started to shake. 28 years had passed. The building hadn't changed, but he had, and still. It wasn't enough. The weight never lifted. The shame never dulled. The crime was like a tumor in his chest, growing, pulsing, inoperable. It wasn't until Eli got his driver's license that Martin realized the terrible truth. He'd spent his whole life trying to forget a moment that would never leave him. And the more his son grew, the more Martin saw Casey in him. Not just the face, but the youth, the potential, the life that Martin had stolen. By then, he had started keeping a letter in his glove box. It was addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." This is the truth about what happened to Casey Bell. He never mailed it, but he carried it everywhere he went, because one day, he knew, someone would have to read it. By his late 40s, Martin Rourke, still living as Daniel Reed, had the life most men would envy: a loving wife, a son in college, a good job running his own repair business. From the outside, it looked like the American dream, but on the inside, something had started to rot. It was subtle at first. He'd lose focus mid-conversation, get lost staring at nothing, snap at Rachel for no reason. She would ask, "What's going on with you lately?" And he'd just shake his head and mumble, "Just tired." But it wasn't exhaustion. It was cracks, spreading across the fragile mask he'd spent decades holding in place. It got worse the night he rear-ended a car at a stoplight. The accident wasn't serious. No one was hurt. But the second Martin heard the sirens, his entire body locked up. When the officer approached his window, flashlight in hand, Martin began to sweat through his shirt. He fumbled his license. His hands shook as he passed over the documents. "Sir," the officer said slowly, "are you okay?" Martin nodded, but inside he was spiraling. For a moment, just a moment, he thought the cop was going to say it. "We know what you did." He didn't. Of course he didn't. It was just a routine call. But Martin couldn't stop trembling until long after he got home. He sat in the garage for 2 hours, door shut, just breathing. After that night, the nightmares became more vivid, more aggressive. Sometimes Casey screamed at him now. Other times he was silent, but pointing to a hole in the ground, or to Martin's son. That's when the drinking started. Not much. Just a glass of whiskey after work. Then 2. Then enough to dull the noise in his head. Rachel noticed. She asked again if he'd see someone. He promised he would. He lied. One afternoon, Martin went into Eli's room while his son was away at college. He looked through his yearbooks, flipped through childhood drawings, watched old videos on his phone. He knew it was obsessive, but he couldn't stop, because Eli was so full of life, so good, so undeserving of the burden he feared would one day crash down on him. What if someone did find out? What if the truth destroyed the family Martin had built? Would Rachel ever forgive him? Would Eli change his name like Martin had? Martin had built everything to protect them. But now he realized the lie didn't protect anyone. It only delayed the pain. He started visiting churches, not because he was religious, but because he was desperate. He would sit in the back pew, week after week, listening to sermons about grace, redemption, confession. He envied people who believed they could be forgiven. One day, he approached the priest. "I did something bad," Martin said. The priest nodded slowly. "We all have things we regret." "No," Martin said. "This is different." But he never said what it was. He couldn't. That fall, Rachel found the letter in his glove box. She didn't open it, but she asked him calmly, "Daniel, who's Casey Bell?" Martin froze. He had been cooking dinner, stirring spaghetti, and the question hit like a thunderclap. He turned to her slowly, heart pounding in his chest. "What?" he said. "The name. On that envelope in your truck. I didn't open it, I swear, but I saw the name." Martin stared at her. He couldn't think, couldn't speak. His mind raced through options. Deny it? Lie again? Say it was from work? But for the first time in his life, he said nothing. Just turned off the stove, walked out the back door, and sat on the porch in the cold until sunrise. Rachel didn't ask again, but she knew something had changed. Over the next few weeks, Martin unraveled quietly. He stopped shaving, barely slept, and one night, after too much whiskey, he went into the garage and started digging through the old box where he kept his journals. He read every page, every confession, every guilt-soaked memory. Then he picked up a pen and wrote one final entry. "I was 19. I made a mistake that killed someone, and I've spent 28 years pretending I could carry it alone. But the truth is, I died that night too. I just didn't realize it until now. I know I can't undo it, but I can stop hiding. Maybe it's not about redemption. Maybe it's just about finally being honest, with myself, with Rachel, with Eli, with the Bell family. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to the police. Whatever happens next, I deserve it." And that's exactly what he did. It was a cold, gray morning in January when Martin Rourke, living as Daniel Reed for nearly 3 decades, drove himself to the Lincoln Police Department. He didn't tell Rachel. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't even leave a note. He just dressed in his usual jacket, tucked the folded confession into his coat pocket, and started driving. The station was quiet. A few officers milled behind the glass. Martin stood in the lobby for a long moment, watching the world through the haze of his own fear. He felt like a ghost stepping into his own funeral. Then he approached the desk. "My name is Martin Rourke," he said softly. "I killed someone 28 years ago. His name was Casey Bell." Detective Elena Brooke had just returned from maternity leave the week before. She was a rookie officer in Fairvale in 1996 when Casey Bell disappeared. Now she was a seasoned detective, tough, sharp-eyed, and known for her instinct. When she got the call about a man confessing to the Bell case, her stomach sank. "This some kind of sick joke?" she asked the officer on the line. "No, ma'am," he said. "You better come down here. He knows things we never released." She sat across from Martin in the interrogation room, eyeing the tired man who looked nothing like a killer, hair graying, hands folded neatly, like he'd just come in to pay a traffic fine. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked. Martin nodded. "I've wanted to for a long time. I couldn't until now." She pressed record, and then, for the next 2 hours, Martin told her everything. The argument, the tire iron, the blood, the panic, the junkyard, the makeshift grave, the years of pretending, the dreams, the guilt, the unraveling. He cried once when he mentioned Casey's sister, Monica. She deserved better. He did too. Elena said nothing. She just let the silence do its work. Once the interview was over, Martin was placed under arrest for second-degree murder. The station buzzed with activity as word spread. A 28-year-old cold case, one that had faded from public memory, was now wide open. Martin didn't ask for a lawyer. He refused to fight the charge. "I'm guilty," he told them. "Do what you need to do." That night, he sat alone in a holding cell, hands clasped in prayer. Not for mercy, not for a lighter sentence, just for peace. When the news broke, Fairvale lit up like a struck match. People shared the headline online with disbelief. "Man confesses to murder in 1996. Casey Bell disappearance. Monica Bell, now in her 40s and a social worker in Omaha, was at work when she got the call from Detective Brooke. She didn't cry. She just sat in silence, staring at a photograph of her brother on her desk, the one where he wore a backwards cap and a mischievous grin. I always knew he didn't run away," she whispered. Then the rage came. The town was split. Some people saw Martin as a coward, a man who ran from justice and only confessed when it was safe, when his life was already built. He had a family, a business, a son, one commenter wrote online. Casey had none of that because of him. Others weren't so quick to judge. "I'm not saying he deserves forgiveness," said Pastor Grant, who had seen Martin at his church. "But I do believe he was tormented every day, and that counts for something." Monica wasn't sure what to feel. "I hate him," she told a local reporter, "but I can't stop pitying him. Isn't that sick? I want him to rot, but I don't know. I just want it all to be over." Rachel, too, was blindsided. When officers showed up at her home to ask questions, she broke down sobbing. "He wasn't violent," she said. "He was quiet, gentle, a good father. I don't understand." She found the journals in the garage the next day. Dozens of them. Pages of guilt, sorrow, memories, and apologies addressed to a boy she'd never met. She spent the night reading every word. By morning, her hands were trembling. "I don't think I ever really knew him," she later said in a private interview. "But I believe he punished himself every day, maybe even more than a court ever could." Eli didn't speak to the media. He didn't go to the hearings. He didn't respond to texts for a week, but eventually he wrote a single post online. "My father did a terrible thing, but he taught me to be honest, and now he's finally living that lesson. I don't know if I can forgive him, but I still love him." The post went viral. Thousands of comments poured in, some kind, some cruel. Martin never saw any of them. He was already in county jail, awaiting formal charges and a sentencing hearing he refused to contest. In his first and only jailhouse interview with the Lincoln Star, Martin gave a quiet, painful statement. Thought time would bury it. That if I stayed good, it might fade. But the truth is, nothing fades. You just learn to carry it, and some weights get heavier with time, not lighter. I don't want sympathy. I don't want a second chance. I just want people to remember Casey, because I never forgot him. Not for 1 second. The courtroom was quiet, eerily so, the day Martin Rourke's sentencing hearing began. It wasn't a trial. There would be no jury, no cross-examinations, no media circus. Martin had waived his right to trial, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, and made it clear through his public defender that he wouldn't contest anything. "I don't want to waste more time," he had said. "Not theirs, not mine, not the Bell family's." Still, the courthouse in Lancaster County was full. Not with crowds or protesters, but with silence. Casey's mother sat in the front row, her hair now fully gray, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Monica Bell sat beside her, jaw clenched, holding back tears. Rachel sat on the other side of the aisle, alone. She hadn't spoken to Martin since his arrest. She looked tired, distant, haunted in a different way, and behind her sat Eli, flanked by 2 friends, his face unreadable. Martin entered the room in an orange jumpsuit. He looked older than ever, thinner, hollowed out. He didn't scan the room. He didn't look for familiar faces. He just sat down and waited. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Martin stood. For a moment, his voice caught in his throat. Then he spoke. "There's no excuse for what I did. I can't explain it in a way that makes sense, because there is no sense to be made. I took a life. I took a son, a brother, a friend. I don't expect forgiveness. But I do want to say something. To the Bell family and to everyone else I lied to for nearly 3 decades. I tried to bury it. Not just the crime, but myself. I became someone else, built a life around a lie, and told myself I could carry the guilt. But I couldn't. Every single day, I saw him. Every time I looked at my son, I saw what I stole." He turned slightly for the first time toward Monica and Mrs. Bell. "I don't deserve peace, but I hope in some small way, you find it. And I hope Casey knows. I never forgot him. He sat down. The room stayed silent. The judge, who had presided over cases for nearly 30 years, paused before delivering the sentence. Mr. Rourke, your confession is rare. Your remorse seems real. But the law doesn't weigh guilt by emotion. It weighs it by consequence. You stole a young man's future. You stole decades from a family who never stopped grieving, and for that, you will serve 20 years to life in prison. The gavel fell. It was done. Monica never stood. She never spoke, but she did leave a letter with the court clerk to be read aloud after sentencing. It was short. My brother was not perfect. He was reckless, loud, sometimes foolish, but he deserved to live, to grow up, to become something. You took that from him, from us. You don't get to give it back with words. Still, I believe you're sorry, and I don't know what to do with that. Maybe one day I'll understand, but not today. After the sentencing, Rachel visited Martin one last time. They sat across from each other, separated by glass. I read everything, she said softly. Martin nodded, eyes damp. I don't hate you, she whispered. I wish I did. It'd be easier. I understand, he said. I never expected you to come. She looked at him, really looked. You were a good husband, a good father. But this means I never really knew you. He nodded again. I didn't know myself either. She hung up the phone and stood to leave. But before she walked away, she said one last thing. Eli still loves you. He just doesn't know what to do with it. Then she was gone. In prison, Martin kept writing. He filled notebook after notebook. Letters to Casey, letters to his son, letters to God, though he still wasn't sure if he believed in one. The final entry in his journal, months later, read, Maybe prison is what I always deserved. But I don't think I came here to be punished. I came here to be honest. And for the first time in my life, that feels like enough. Months passed. The media moved on. Other cases took over the headlines. New crimes, new faces. But for the people left behind in Martin Rourke's wake, the story didn't end in the courtroom. For Monica Bell, closure was elusive. She kept replaying Martin's words in her head, not because she forgave him, but because he said them at all. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was something. She visited her brother's old grave marker on the 29th anniversary of his disappearance, now updated with a date of death. There were fresh flowers on the stone. She didn't know who put them there, but she had a feeling. For Rachel, the house felt emptier than ever. Martin's tools were still in the garage. His jackets hung by the door for months before she could bring herself to donate them. She told people he had died because, in a way, he had. The man she married, the man she raised a son with. She didn't know where that man ended and the one who killed Casey began. But she also knew this. He had loved them. That much had been real. She kept the journals, all of them, in a box beneath her bed. Some nights she read pages at random, reminders of the man who had broken her heart, and tried to redeem it. As for Eli, he remained quiet. A few friends knew, most didn't. He changed his last name back to Rourke, not because he was proud of it, but because he refused to live in hiding. My dad lived behind a mask his whole life, he said to a close friend. I'm done with that. But privately, he wrote a letter to Casey Bell. I wish I knew you. I wish none of this happened. But I want you to know, your story changed mine. I'll carry it with me, always. In prison, Martin kept to himself. He taught GED classes to younger inmates. He spent hours in the library mostly reading philosophy and theology, books about guilt, forgiveness, and consequence. In letters to Rachel, which she rarely answered, he never once asked for anything. No favors, no visits, just updates on Eli, his grades, his goals, his life. Once she wrote back, "He's okay, we both are, in our own ways." Then came the final twist, quiet and unexpected. 6 years after Martin's sentencing, Rachel received a letter, handwritten, stamped from the state correctional facility in Omaha. But it wasn't from Martin. It was from a young man named Luis Mendoza, an inmate who had shared a cell with Martin during his final year of life. "I don't know if this is overstepping," the letter began, "but your husband asked me to send this if something happened to him. He said it was his last piece of the truth. I figured it mattered. Martin had passed away in his sleep. Natural causes, no drama, no incident. But what Rachel found enclosed would stay with her forever. It was one final letter, written to Casey. Dear Casey, this will be the last time I write to you. Not because I've stopped thinking about you, but because there's nothing left to say that I haven't already written 100 times. I don't expect to meet you on the other side. I don't know if there is another side. But if there is, and if you're there, I hope you'll recognize that I spent my life trying to make peace with the worst thing I ever did. I've learned that guilt is not a punishment. It's a compass. It pointed me back to you, over and over, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I never got to know the man you would have become, but I carry your name. Every time I breathe, I carry it. I'm sorry. I've always been sorry. Martin." Rachel folded the letter and held it against her chest. Then she lit a single candle, placed it by the window, and let it burn through the night. Not for Martin, not for Casey, but for all the lives that were touched, broken, and reshaped by one moment of irreversible violence, and the long road toward facing it. Years later, when people speak of the Casey Bell case, they speak quietly. It isn't a story that gets told with drama or fanfare. It's not a sensational headline or a cautionary tale shouted from the rooftops. It's something more haunting than that, more human. They talk about a boy who never got to grow up, a man who ran for nearly 30 years and then chose to stop running, a family shattered by grief but not defined by it, and a question that lingers in every heart that hears the story. What would I have done? Because the haunting confession of a killer who regretted their actions isn't just a tale of crime. It's a story about what we carry, what we bury, and whether redemption is something we earn, or something we chase until our final breath. Martin Rourke spent a lifetime trying to forget one choice, only to realize that memory isn't what punishes us. It's what keeps us human. Some crimes are solved with evidence, others with confession. But the most haunting ones, they're solved by time and by truth finally clawing its way to the surface. Thank you for joining us on this journey into guilt, grief, and the quiet horror of living with what can't be undone. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. Do you believe a killer can truly be redeemed? Of violence. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next chilling, emotional, and unforgettable story. Because to understand the darkest crimes, you have to look beneath the surface.